Our SandBox webinar series is intended to provide event organizers and the event community with as much useful and usable information as possible. We know from our conversations with our customers that the millennial audience is something of great interest. A number of our clients are trying to determine how do we evolve our shows, how do we evolve our communications, marketing of the shows so that we're capturing the attention and providing the right engagement tactics to the millennial audience. So that's what Tom's going to help us with today. So let me just introduce Tom, if I may. I met Tom a few years ago before I came to Shepherd. I was doing a consulting project with the Coca-Cola company and had the good fortune of spending some time with him. And ever since then, I've been looking for an opportunity to work with Tom. So we had Tom come to our SandBox customer event back in the spring and just had a wonderful session. So we've invited Tom back for this webinar to talk about millennials. Tom is the founder of Macroforces, Inc. Previous to forming Macroforces, Tom was the global director of human and cultural insights for the Coca-Cola company. And prior to that, he worked at Cheskin Consulting out on the West Coast. He serves on the National Academy of Sciences Roundtables for Social and Behavioral Sciences. He's an advisor to the Masters of Market Research program at UGA. And Tom is busy speaking all over the world, imparting his knowledge to folks everywhere. So Tom, with that, thank you very much for being here, and let's go.
All right, thank you very much. Well, hello everybody. This presentation, like you said, should take about 35 minutes, and the topic you all should know is we're going to be looking at millennials. And why is it we're looking at millennials is going to be the first question that I look at. And then I'm going to follow this up by letting you know a little bit about the cultural research approach that is the lens through which we look at these millennials. It's different than the typical market research. Market research is where I worked for several years. I did as a market researcher both at Coca-Cola and before that. But when it comes to understanding you as a consumer, it's different than understanding you as a human being. And so the cultural research looks much more at the full, richer life of you as a human being. And you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. You are a person that's going to be affected by your environment. We all are. We have our own personality traits, but quite frankly, I find the more I study human behavior, you put me in a certain situation and I will behave very differently. So the question is, what were the environmental forces around this millennial group as they grew up that shaped them? And we're going to look at that from 4 different angles. Then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of cover off what are the things I'd like you to know about them. This is the first of 2 presentations. What we'll find today is a description of these folks, get to know them. The next step in the next presentation will be how do I communicate with them? So just as a definition, millennials are people who are around 19 to 35 years old today. And this generation is younger than 3 other generations that are fun to compare them to. The Generation X and the Boomers. The Boomers right now are 52 to 70 years old. There's a lot of, they were one of the biggest generations ever. Now millennials have kind of come along and are a big generation that is really changing the makeup of the world. And in particular, what the millennials are doing is they're changing the makeup of the workforce. Because now that they're at 19 to 35 years old, they're at the point where most of them have left their college years and are joining the workforce. And so the composition of those in the workforce is changing. The people coming to your events are most likely those who are in some kind of business or industry. And the chart on the right there is simply showing you that about last year was the first year that millennials became the majority of the people in the workforce. You see a downward slope to the boomers line because simply they are aging out. We're losing about 3 million boomers to retirement every year. And as that happens year after year after year, we're going to see the percentage of people in the workforce, meaning the percentage of people likely to come to your events, are going to be millennials. Some of the projections I've seen have us going well beyond 50%, say by 2025. There's a great woman out in California named Mary Meeker. She works for a venture capitalist firm. If you've heard of Kleiner Perkins, it's a company that what they do is they study how society is changing and then they make investments in companies. And they are known as having one of the best track records in the world. They have invested in Twitter and Amazon and Uber, a lot of the most highly profitable companies that have come out of Silicon Valley. And when they issue their report every year, it's a very big event in the world of electronics. What I've pulled from here is what she starts with is before she gets into the electronics trends, she looks at the makeup of all these different social groups. So using the generational cohorts that we'll be looking at today, she gets all this data, and I'm going to point out just 4 things she says here. One of them is that being an urban dweller is very different today. It's much more normal than it was. The boomers had about 68% of them lived in urban areas, and today almost all the millennials are living some type of an urban life. Also, that it's much more normal to be around people who are not white. There's a lot of talk about this, and right now you're seeing that the boomers grew up with 77% of the people being white, and now millennials, it's down to 57%, and within a few years it'll be about 50-50. So they just grew up with a wider variety of people types around them. Unmarried, this is a really big trend because look at the difference in this. When they were 20 to 35 years old, the boomers were about half of them had already been married. And then for the millennials, the married people, 28% are married. So the majority of them, 72%, are unmarried. It's simply becoming more of a accepted thing that you may be living with somebody, you may be in a serious relationship, but you're not married. And often a lot of the millennials are just living with friends. They're co-sharing a house to save money. And then lastly, one of the biggest demographic shifts has simply been we are becoming an overall more educated society. And in particular, the women have really been increasing this much more than the men. And year after year, we're finding more and more people who are graduating. The majority of them are women. So I've used this word normal here 4 different times. And I want to point out something about the use of this word, because this is a key kind of insight from a social psychology standpoint. What is normal for you may not be normal for anybody else. And the question is, what is normal for millennials? And I tried to focus in on things that I thought were not only just normal for them, but perhaps not as normal for other groups, particularly boomers. This is a person, Douglas Adams. If you heard of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know him as the author of that. In the world that I belong to the Association of Professional Futurists, and you'd be surprised how much of what futurists look at comes from the world of science fiction. Science fiction, their entire job is to sit around and think about what will be different tomorrow. And as somebody who's been working in market research and human and cultural research, trying to figure out how will the world change so that businesses can adapt, we have found that science fiction has become a really fun source. A couple of friends of mine have actually, Ari Popper, if you just Google the name Ari Popper, you'll find that he's actually started a company called Sci Futures that uses science fiction to help companies develop what their future will look like. But when he talks about what was around you when you were born, it's normal, it's ordinary. What was around these millennials as they were growing up? Because if I told you that they were different, you should challenge me and ask, okay, why are they different? And the answer almost always should be because of their environment. The environment what were the changes in their environment that caused them to be different than people like me who are much older? I'm a boomer myself. So that's what we're about to go into.
Tom, one quick little piece of housekeeping I missed out on. We are recording this webinar, and tomorrow, for all those who attended, you receive an email from me, and that email will be 2 things. One will be a link so that you can go ahead and watch the webinar on your own, and also a download of the PDF of Tom's deck.
Okay, so we are a product of our environment, as I said, and so we're going to go into figuring out, while these millennials are figuring out their identity, they're trying to figure out their role in life, particularly your formative years, starting around your teen years through your 20s, you're trying to figure out who am I and how do I fit into this world? You're also trying to understand the larger world. And the last point on the box on the left there is an important one. Our environments are changing so fast these days that the cohort differences, the differences between generations are greater than ever. If you look back at the generation from like the 1850s to the 1870s, and our country was not changing. This is all pre-industrial revolution, and so it was really not changing that much. But now the degree of change generation to generation is quite large. Your environment, I see this as 4 different environments. You have your natural environment, you have your built environment, that's the stuff that people make. Also our economic environment. Our economic environment has to do with the money and the economy and businesses, but there's also the social world. And of those 4, I'd say the social world, the people around you, you have a social environment. Who you hang around with affects who you are. Who is an in-group and an out-group? We're seeing a lot of in-group and out-group is a really interesting concept from social psychology, where you find that millennials are expanding their idea of who should be considered an in-group, or whose do we accept as being quote unquote normal again. You've all, I'm sure, have felt differences in how we think about gays and lesbians. It used to be they were an out-group. Now they're becoming much more of an in-group. If you're African American, you know this feeling. It's part of what's going on with the Black Lives Matters discussion. Muslims are a new out-group. But the point is, the people around us affect who we become. So if we look at some of the millennial changes, the millennial highlights that I'm going to be talking about is their environment changed in the natural. They have to deal with global warming. They had a lot of animal rights issues. The food system was industrialized. They are the first one. We all know that the electronics in their built environment have changed. And I'm also going to cover some of the economic and social things. This is an outline of what we'll be talking about, but let's actually just get right into it. So the first environment that you need to look at to try to understand millennials is the natural environment. And by that, I mean all the plants and animals and trees. And every child in every society, we love animals. That's why almost all little kids have stuffed animals in every culture around the world. We have an affinity for them, particularly when we are young. It's human nature. And if you have heard that millennials are cause-oriented, well, that's very, very true. 6 out of 10 of them belong to some type of a cause, and the #1 type of cause that they belong to is an animal's rights type of a cause. A distinction that that this generation holds that's different than previous generations is, why do we come together and start an NGO? It's because governments and businesses are not solving a problem we're concerned about. Whether it's about global warming, whether it's about animal rights, we want to join PETA, we want to join Amnesty International. These are things that we believe are important, but governments and businesses are not addressing them. We as individuals, the people, need to make the change. Millennials are joining that way of thinking, whereas 6 out of 10 of them now are involved in trying to change the world through non-government and non-business ways. An example would be, there's big differences in veganism these days. You're going to see that almost everywhere you go. It's going to be on almost all the menus you see, but look at the differences there. This generation of millennials are far more likely, 1 out of 8 of them at this point, will say that they have been a vegan or are a vegan. And it's very much about how you feel about the morality of how animals are treated. Think about them growing up. We're the first generation that had computers, and they could actually see things, so that when PETA went undercover and showed these horrible videos of how animals were treated, or a lot of people will remember things like rabbits being used to test cosmetics. All of these conversations were going on as these children were, #1, interested in animals, #2, trying to figure out what the world is like. The movies on the right there were really about movies that showed how we have to treat animals well. Now, the planet, of course, is something that everybody knows millennials are involved with right now. And what they're doing is responding to the conversations that were going on around them. They were talking about the rainforest and the ozone and global warming. Look at the list of events there by year. They saw some pretty horrifying images of the Exxon Valdez. And Captain Planet was teaching young kids how to save the planet. They were hearing about the Kuwaiti oil fields. They'd turn on the news and just see horrible air pollution. As a child, seeing these things were considered like a big deal or even traumatic issues. And in some cases, if you look at the 2005 listing there, these kids are starting to sign up and do things. They're saying, we're going to have a group that we come together and formed called Teens Turning Green. what has ended up happening is as those kids grew and went to college, that picture of those kids there, they're demanding that their college divest from investing in companies that are coal companies, for example. These have become important issues, and they're getting together to try to do something about it. One of the women who formed Teens Turning Green is Erin Schrody, and she became the youngest woman ever to run for US Congress just recently. She is 25 years old, and when she looked at Congress and realized she doesn't see people like her, she doesn't see millennials making the rules. She decided, well, if we aren't there, we're gonna have to get there, and she decided to run for office. There's something called Google Ngram. You all can use it yourself, but all this shows is that blue area is when these kids were growing up, all right? When you start to say, I'm gonna be understanding the broader world, the conversation around dolphin-safe tuna was really starting to rise. Previous generations didn't grow up with that as a conversation. Previous generations didn't grow up hearing people talking about the ozone layer. Notice how we all heard about that, in the 90s, but we don't hear about it anymore. Different conversations are starting, and one of those is global warming. We're hearing a lot about global warming. Why are millennials different and so concerned about this? These are the issues that were part of the larger conversation in society that were present when they came of age. One more that's really taking off, and I think it's going to change a lot of things. I came from the food industry, and the GMO conversation, even whether or not we put GMO on labels, is a big deal right now. And kids today, or I'm sorry, millennials, I sound like a boomer when I say kids today, don't I? This is an important issue to them. You get a lot of scientists that'll say, but we have data proving that there is no reason to be worried about this. Even though that's true, that's not the conversation that the millennial wants to hear. The millennial wants to hear, you as a food company are concerned about this issue. Don't tell me science says it's safe. Say that you're concerned about my health and safety. And this is completely changing our food industry right now. Millennials, 43% of them do not trust big food companies. In fact, that term big food is something, if you go ahead and Google it, you'll find that there's a huge conversation about it. There's a movie that just came out called Fed Up that's about this. There's lots of different movies. Super Size Me came out. That was a millennial movie. They do not see the industrialized food as something that's on their side. Now look at the 18%. That's how many people that are older that say they don't trust the food company. There's a very big distinction there. And they are reshaping the food industry. On the bottom corner there, you see I got a picture of those cereals from General Mills. General Mills is really responding in an interesting way. They've decided to take all the artificial colors out of their cereals that ad is for, but they also have recently paid a record-breaking amount for a company. They just bought Annie's Food, and all the Annie's organic foods are now owned by General Mills. Plum Organics just sold to Campbell's. The large mega food companies are realizing to appeal to these millennials, they need to start going to these smaller companies. But don't think that they're all about health and wellness. They actually do smoke and they do drink, and everybody does when they're younger. When you get older, you tend to do less of those things. But still, millennials are smoking and drinking at rates that are higher than other generations right now. So I'm not saying that all they do is good. We all know we should eat well, but we also know that we have our vices too. Okay, now the built environment is one that a lot of people like to talk about because it's where technology exists. These millennials were raised in minivans, they were raised in SUVs. This is the generation that these vehicles were designed for. Their moms were their soccer moms, and they just drove them everywhere. We hear a lot about them being overscheduled. We hear about these kids being controlled. Remember there's a lot of safety and concerns in the world. And so there was a lot of protecting your children. I believe that there's a counter trend right now because millennials who were raised like this, raised as overscheduled kids, raised as overprotected kids, are now the ones having children. And they are showing a tendency to want to raise their kids in a much looser way and giving them much more freedom. There's a book out called Free Range Kids that's making quite the rounds among millennials right now. But there's also just some of the implications of that as we start to spend more time in our SUVs and our minivans. Drive-through sales just skyrocketed. Since these kids were born, the percentage of food sold through QSRs, the quick service restaurants like McDonald's and Burger King, the percentage of revenue that comes through the drive-through is now much greater than the revenue that comes through the people that just come in and sit inside. I also put gas station food is growing there too. This generation buys so much online that they don't really go out and just go shopping anymore. The few times you actually have to go to a store is to go get gas. And it's really causing a lot of these gas stations to take a chunk of the business away from fast food restaurants. They're selling a lot more prepared foods and prepared meals. And I can see that that's definitely a trend that's going to continue. If I was Wendy's right now, I would consider companies like QT to be more of a competitor than even some of the other fast food restaurants. In fact, QT here in Atlanta has just opened up a store that doesn't even sell gasoline anymore. All they do is sell the prepared foods and the packaged foods. All of you who were millennials, I hope you're seeing something, at least a few items on here that you grew up with. And those like me who raised millennials, I bought most of these things for my kids. These are the toys that they played with. The built world that they played with as children looks like this. And if you want to bring up some nostalgia, just bring up some of these with your millennials. But notice that Buzz Lightyear is different on this page. He's the only one that could light up. He had electronics in him. As this generation was growing up, look what happened to their toys. They're the first generation to experience interactive toys. Tamagotchi, I was talking to a millennial yesterday. When I brought up the word Tamagotchi, she lit up. And she's like, oh, so nostalgic about it. The Game Boy, most boys can remember their first time they got a Game Boy. We have given these kids items that would interact with them. And if they did something, the toy would do something back. We talk about them wanting to interact. Well, look how we raised them. They were the first generation who had these types of toys that actually could respond to them. So what might be the effect? You know, I made up a word here, electronification. I play a lot of Scrabble and I make up words in Scrabble, and I might as well make them up in the real world too. But they expect that interactive experience, but it also means if it doesn't interact with you, you move on to the next thing. And we're hearing that about the impulse society and millennials needing to have something to occupy their attention. It's a really interesting point. If I'm putting on an event and I want to occupy their attention, I have to realize that if they aren't entertained every 10 seconds or so, they might be going somewhere else. We know that's a behavior they have. Now we have to figure out, how do we respond to that? If you have any questions about how we might respond to that, go ahead and think of them now and we can address those later. If you heard of the Internet of Things, this group right here who saw that their toys got electronified, well, when it comes to your toaster or your thermostat or your car or anything to do with your house, your air conditioning, these people are going to be very much into embracing that. Alexa right now, simply, you could just say, Alexa, turn down the air conditioner, and your house can respond to your voice commands. That's going to become more and more common. And when they're going to get you to the point where if they see a speaker that they can't talk to and have it turn up or turn down, it's going to be considered broken. You've seen these videos of like little 2-year-olds trying to swipe a magazine and it doesn't swipe the way an iPad does. These are the kinds of behaviors that people are taught by the things that they grew up with. Another one of the trends, this group is very much visually sophisticated. And what I mean by that is Apple really used design to sell its products. The key driver behind this, I did a deep dive onto this one time, and we had something called Six Sigma and total quality management. And almost every industry upped the quality of their products to the point where quality variance was at a really high level, and every competitor was at a high level. So you didn't differentiate on quality as much as you did in the past. So what happened in category after category, whether it was clothing or cars or electronics, we would use design as a competitive tool, because quality we needed that extra thing that made our high quality product more desirable. The point is, they got raised on a much higher aesthetic than every previous generation. And on the bottom corner there, you see that there's even, they do this so often that if you get on Facebook, the #1 thing that's photographed is food. You talk to any millennial and watching food shows is extremely popular. And you could use words that you couldn't use in the past, things like plating, you know, like, wow, they understand the design world. I would love to be thinking about how this group communicates through photographs. You have an environment that you would love to have them photograph because that's how you advertise. Their photos to their friends and associates are going to be some of your best advertising. So the question is, how do you make sure that you help them take the type of photo they want to share? All right, this is, there's tons and tons of this type of data here. I have very little here, but if you want more, I can direct you to it. A lot of the sources that I have for the data here, if you've used PowerPoint, you know that there's a notes section, and in the notes sections, I always have the source reports. So you can get lots more information on electronics. But one of them to keep in mind is that they are watching a lot less TV and they're doing a lot more streaming, and video on the go is growing. So at CES, they had a guy from YouTube who was talking this year about not just millennials, but the generation coming out underneath them. Millennials communicate in photos. The younger generation, they are communicating with video. And when you look at behaviors of both millennials and that younger generation, they're watching a lot more video online. In fact, for the younger generation below millennials, it has now surpassed social media. Watching video is the fastest growing. When you think about the number of minutes they spend looking at a screen, the part that is being occupied by Netflix and YouTube and Hulu and all these other streaming devices is by far the fastest growing. Okay, now on the economic front, this group of college kids right here grew up in a world that caused them to have different attitudes toward money. One of the most important things that a sociologist would tell you is that the millennials grew up in a much richer society. Their parents had more money than any previous generation, and it's been going up like crazy. Look at the differences here. When those silent generation, when they were in their 20s or 30s, a typical person made $8,000 a year. These are remarkably huge differences here. So the question is, we have a generation that grew up in a world of abundance and wealth. How did that affect them? There's a guy who's trying to answer that question named Robert Gordon. He's written this book that's on the bestseller list right now called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And it's being talked about as one of the books of the year in terms of one of the best business books or economics books. He's got if you want to get an idea of what the book talks about, there's the title of his TED Talk that you can go watch. And this is a graph from one of his TED Talks. I took this data here to show you that those generations that are earning a lot of money that I just showed you, prior to that silent generation, look at that straight line. We did not have economic growth. These are growth rates. So is the economy growing 1% or 2% or 3% a year? The economy barely grew. It was almost at zero, all the way up until the 1800s where it starts to creep up, and then it just skyrockets. The greatest generation that came before the silent generation, this is the group that built the world that we all occupy today. They grew up, they really were probably one of the luckiest because they exist at a time when the difference between the amount of wealth you expect to have when you were young and when you were older grew at the greater rate than any other previous generations. The silent generation was at the peak right there. These are the folks that really, they were the parents of the boomers, and they're the ones who are pictured on the cover of the book there. They built the world that was able to create the factories that built all the different World War II, all the planes and tanks and everything that were built by them. The boomers were the ones that came right after the war ended. And we had all this pent up demand. We had all this factory production. The rest of the world wasn't doing well at all. And US economy just exploded. We had year after year growth. The boomers really grew up in a world where they were very, very fortunate. Their parents had created a world of wealth for them. Then the Gen X people, notice that the line behind their shaded box, and that box represents the years that they are likely to be working. And then if I go to millennials, look what's happening to them. They cannot expect that year after year, the economy is going to get better. They're going to be living in a world where economic growth is going to be much harder to come by. So the question is, how is that going to affect their attitudes toward money? The Great Recession was one of their first big events in their life. And a lot of people are talking about them perhaps being much more economically conservative than previous generations. Go ahead and Google this yourself sometime and just like millennial entrepreneurs. This right here shows you that millennials are really starting a lot of companies. They're going to be successful. And there's that big me. If you're reading Fast Company or Wired, you're going to hear a lot of that kind of stuff. But honestly, when you start to look at the data coming from people who do broader studies like economists do, this gentleman, Laforge, was testifying in front of Congress saying, you know, they really are on track to not be that innovative. The idea that our economy isn't going to be growing more than 1%, the only way to raise that number is if we have a lot of invention, a lot of creativity. We want to spark that, but we're not seeing it. This generation, the share of people under 30 who own a business has actually been falling since the 1980s. So what's going to happen when it comes to innovation? When the book that Gordon wrote that I was just talking about, The Rise and Fall of American Economics, he was pointing out that almost all the innovations of the last 10 to 20 years have been in the world of entertainment. It's about Facebook and watching movies online. These are not things that really add to the well-being of people. So even though they grew up in a world of abundance, there's been studies, this one of these is a Harvard study at the top there, where they are asking questions, and it's that Federal Reserve study. The Federal Reserve found that of millennials, if you had like a medical accident or a car breakdown, you could not afford, half of them could not afford $400. All right, what they would have to do is sell something or put it on credit or borrow it from a friend or a parent. They are very strapped for money. There's a rich-poor divide that a lot of us don't see, and I'm not so sure it's that important to folks that are putting on events like yours, because you're going to probably attract all the people who are doing well. You're going to attract the people who have jobs. But most millennials, and this report here focuses on the broader group of millennials, keep in mind that most of them, 61% of those making a minimum wage are millennial. When we saw that 20% of millennials are in poverty right now, their unemployment rate is higher, they have a lot of debt. That was a part of the debate cycle that we just went through. The campaign cycle. Student loans are now, as a group, there's more there's more money owed on student loans than are owed on mortgages or on credit cards. Student loans have gotten ridiculously out of hand. And these young people are making less money. And many of them, when you ask them, how are you going to be able to pay off your loan, have no idea. So their outlook, even though they're a very wealthy group, this is the Harvard study. And when they were asked, are you optimistic? Notice that 15%, 1/5, think the country's moving in the right direction. That's not a lot of optimism for a group that is living in a world that's richer and wealthier than any previous generation. So we have to keep in mind that there is a bit of tension and concern about what the future holds for them. I don't have the data in here, but it's really an interesting psychological insight into all people, which is when you ask them about their own prospects, most people are more optimistic about their own future. But when you ask them about the prospects for the country as a whole, they tend to be much more negative. This just blew me away. When Bernie Sanders was being called a democratic socialist, the idea was maybe a few college students on the West Coast or the East Coast would be thinking like that. This study is from Harvard, not exactly a bastion of liberalism. Found that only 19% of the millennials identify as a capitalist. 42 of them say they support capitalism, but that's less than half. This is a really interesting insight. And given that most of what you folks are doing has to do with businesses and corporations and people that are in the working world, attitudes toward capitalism and attitudes toward business are changing extremely rapidly. There's something called the Edelman trust scores. If you go out there and want to see who do people trust, large corporations are now the second least trusted. The only people that American businesses are trusted less than American business is American Congress. Our Congress is really down in the single digits at this point, and I think large American corporations as a whole are trusted somewhere around in the mid-teens. And this just helps to make the point. I don't know how many of you have seen this chart, but if only millennials voted, it would be overwhelmingly for Hillary, because the Democratic policies tend to be more aligned with their thinking. But even more so, remember how much the millennials were going for Bernie? All the stuff I was just showing you about student loans, about optimism for the future, about capitalism. Those are all key components of Bernie's campaign. And that was why millennials were really being attracted to him. So just to summarize some of these things, there's a lot of variance. When we talk about millennials, understand some are doing well, some are doing poorly. There's a rich-poor divide that they're all much more aware of than more people that are older. Millennials are attending conferences, are more likely to be the better off, but they still struggle with money. Even if you have a job, that $400, keep in mind that these people are still at a point where they're just struggling to get by. They're not saving, they're just barely paying their bills and paying off their student loans. And their outlook on life is brighter for their own personal outlook than for the country as a whole. Okay, the last one I want to go into is their environment on the social environment. And these are the types of pictures that we think of when we think of their social environment, because they socialize with each other a lot. But I wanted to bring up some, and definitely that's a truism, and I'm not going to argue that at all. That's definitely a key insight. But here's some, I just wanted to broaden that perspective on what is meant by their social environment. Because 55% of these millennials say that their parent is one of their best friends. All right, they are much closer to their parents than the previous generations were to their parents. And a lot of them are on Facebook, and the numbers are just stunning. To have any product that has 95% penetration is amazing. And the fact that it's not just that they signed up for it, they're actually using it. The average millennial is on Facebook more than a half an hour a day. LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, these all, more than half of millennials are on, or Instagram is something used by more than half of millennials, and the same can be said for LinkedIn and Twitter. The millennial moms, keep in mind that when we're talking about an 18 to 35 or 19 to 36 year, that's a huge lifespan, a huge chunk of time where many different life events happen. You start off in college, you go out on your own, and then you maybe even start your own family. The older millennials are the ones who are having most of the babies now. 90% of all the babies were born in the US were born to millennial moms last year. But also keep in mind when they say that they're being social, by far their number one favorite event is going out to dinner with friends. It's one of their favorite leisure time activities. And when you ask a millennial, what have you done with your social life lately? That's almost always the number one answer. And then finally, part of sociality is about whether I work with you or against you. And remember, they said that they were not thinking of themselves as capitalists, because capitalism is seen as I win, you lose, I put you out of business. They're much more into that collaborative thing. And that's not just internally. Of course, we all want coworkers that we collaborate with, but they like to see companies that collaborate with each other across industries. And that collaboration can be a company with a government or a company with another company. When you're talking about you're valuing the social side of your life, which millennials certainly do, something's got to give. I don't have it on this chart, but a friend of mine wrote a book. Colin Beavan wrote a book called No Impact Man. And he wanted to live as a millennial, having minimalizing his impact on the environment. And when you read through the book, you read through all the things he gave up and how he changed the types of foods he bought. And you hear about all his lifestyle changes. But the last chapter of the book talks about, what did I learn from this experience? And he said, when I got rid of that stuff in my life that was causing my ecological footprint to be larger, by getting rid of it, I made a smaller ecological footprint, but I ended up having more time with my friends and my family. I spent less time with stuff and more time with people. And I feel like my life has been better for that one key reason. A lot of economists are really concerned that millennials just aren't buying things the way they used to. Just think about what's in your phone right now. You don't have to buy an encyclopedia. You can go on WikiLeaks, all the records and CDs you could buy. Well, you don't buy those anymore. All the things, the maps that you have on your phone, there's probably another dozen I'm not even mentioning right now. We've dematerialized a lot of the stuff in our lives. Uber and other car sharing companies are keeping millennials from buying cars. A lot of car companies, I have a coworker, somebody who does what I do, trying to understand the future, working at Ford, and some of their data on how many kids are planning to buy a car, it's going way, way down. So the question is, how does a company like Ford or Chrysler, GM stay in business when these people are buying fewer cars? Even getting a driver's license, those numbers have come way down. But what are they buying more of? buying experiences, and the big chunk of that again is people going out and spending time with friends. It's not going on an African safari. It's as simple as going to a coffee shop with your friends. That's what they really enjoy doing. They're buying a lot more high quality and fresh foods. Their percentage of their disposable income that goes to food is greater than it was for young people of previous generations when they were the same age. And then finally, I wanted to point out that rich-poor divide, there are a lot of people who don't have the money that they want a car, they just can't afford a car. There's a lot of people who are at the particular, we all know what it's like to be young and not to have had a career that's taken up to the point where you're making significant money yet. So I don't want to say that this is all by choice. Sometimes it's a matter of means. One of the consequences of this is that economists are giving serious consideration to figure out what does it mean when the GDP goes up. It usually means that you spent money and you bought stuff, because that's how they created the GDP metrics when they first invented it. There are things that you spend money on that are not stuff. And maybe if you have more free time, should that go into the GDP metrics? They're asking questions that are about what is it we truly value? And maybe some of that non-stuff items, some of those non-material items need to be added to our calculations. One of the more unhappy aspects of the millennials is that this is the first generation that grew up with the internet. And as a teenager, they could get online and see things that many parents would rather just protect their children from. The Rodney King video was online, and the Oklahoma City bombing, all those different events. These are very sort of unnerving events for people, because if you're a child and when you heard about 9/11, it made an impression. And to see the Rodney King beating and to understand that the world isn't as nice as maybe you thought it was, to see people suffering. I was talking about in 2004, we had the tsunami. A lot of teenagers are really hurt by that. They saw real families and kids their own age that were devastated by that. Notice that what's happened is we're so connected to the world that we're starting to feel the same pain that they are feeling. We all were tweeting money to Haiti at the same time. A lot of teenagers were involved in that type of philanthropy because they had a phone that they could tweet a donation with. If you add up all of that, a guy named Jeremy Rifkin wrote this book called The Empathic Society. He believes that we are becoming much more empathetic. We are saying, I care for all people. And you're seeing nationalism go down, not just in the US, but around the world. People care about everybody, about people, and not so much about just their country. But there's also negative parts of this. That little boy that you see there, we are now at a point where kids are going off to college and we have to have trigger warnings and safe spaces from them because they are upset by some of the things they're hearing. We are coddling these children. And that article is a great story about these kids that grow up overprotected now are having a hard time adjusting to being able to meet people they disagree with. The book, It's Complicated, is wonderful. Any of you who have a teenager, please read this. It's about what it's like to try to figure out who you are and how you present yourself in the digital world. The same issues of who am I and how do I relate to the world that teens have always dealt with are changing very much. We have cyberbullying, we have fat shaming. Those two girls right there could be looking at a computer screen where all their other friends look like they're having fun and going to parties and all the girls look skinny and pretty. It's called the Facebook effect. We only put the best parts of our lives up there, so we all look like our lives are less fun than everybody else's. As a society, the loneliness and the isolation levels are going way up. And then finally, that last book, they're called Emerging Adulthood. There's Arnett, who wrote this book. He's hypothesizing it's not just an extended adolescence, but we have a truly new life stage where these young, particularly young men who grew up playing video games are really not becoming mature. It's like if you Google the phrase, where are all the men, you'll find that there's a lot of young women lamenting that these young men are staying boyish and boy-like for a much longer period of time. So those are the social forces that are around us. Racial diversity, there's even others, like there's more women in positions of power. We're about ready to possibly elect our first female president, but also they grew up with the aging boomers around them. And an interesting insight, Eric Erickson, who studied life stages, points out that when you become 40, that's when you start thinking of other people. You've started your career, maybe you started your family, and you start doing more donating. You do more volunteering. You help out with the church. You're taking care of elder parents who are aging. You're helping your kids. It's a natural progression. When you're about 40 years old, you start becoming what he called other-oriented. we have more people around us who are other oriented. And so it's causing this younger generation to see these kind of behaviors more often. It's having an effect on them. And of course, they've grown up now with a lot of their Zuckerberg and other heroes who are the nerds. We used to make fun of them, kick sand in their face was the old trope. But now it's like my daughter, who if she comes home, she's 24 years old, she says, Dad, I'm going to marry a man, and I find out that he's a Silicon Valley nerd. I'm not going to say that's a problem. I'm just be like, yes, that's great. Just look at all the talk about STEM sciences these days. We actually see being smart as something that's worthwhile now. So the question to summarize all this up is, all that stuff is changing around them. I just talked about a few of them. We had all these different social changes around them. What is it that the effect of these women around them, the effect of these older people, the effect of this worshiping of smart, what effect did it have on them? Keep in mind the other things that were changing too. They are now more educated and they love their environment. They're very connected. They're concerned about the rich-poor divide. How is these things in their life causing them to think differently than we have? Or to put it another way, because they've experienced these things, it's normal to have certain attitudes, behaviors, and values. Those normal attitudes, behaviors, and values they are much more open-minded than a lot of previous generations. They are concerned with other people much more than others, previous generations. And social business models, and when I say other-oriented, every generation is concerned for others, but it's happening at a much younger age than previous generations. They are more concerned with social business. They don't want to simply know what is your company doing to make a great product or to provide a great service, but are you helping your community? Are you hiring African Americans? Are you providing leave for young men who have kids at home? Collaboration over competition. The way I like to put it when I go out there speaking to different companies is you still need to compete, but show that you're competing with society against a social ill. You're competing with society to help the obesity epidemic, global warming, unemployment. The competition isn't for me to win and you to lose. The competition is so that we defeat something that is negative in our shared lives. They're looking for more time with their friends and their family. They're valuing being in the moment. They're valuing things like connecting to each other. So the idea of the workaholic, which was, if you were to say, wow, I worked 80 hours this week, that was a way of bragging and of pride. It's less so for this younger generation. Being able to, there's a website called Walkable Cities. They're looking for places to live that allow them to have more leisure in their life. And then lastly, big is not trusted. Big governments, big business, big religions are all losing favor with this group. If you're a large company, why is it that Coca-Cola and General Mills and Hormel and all these other big companies are buying all the little ones? It's because people don't trust the big companies. These big companies can make exactly the same products. They simply don't have trust. And we don't believe that government is addressing the problems that we want to address. That's one of the reasons why NGOs are really up and causes are on the rise too. So at this point, I've gone through a whirlwind of information. I provided a lot. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear if you had any thoughts. You can either send them in right now or send them to me. That's my Twitter account right there. I could answer these in our next presentation, which is coming in a week. But I would love for you to give me ideas on how we can apply what we just learned to helping you do your job better in the future, and what it would mean to you to do something different that improves your ability to attract, connect with, and really wow the millennial generation.